What if nothing in your life was a coincidence? A book falls off the shelf exactly when you're thinking about that subject. Or someone you haven't seen in years shows up at the exact moment you needed to talk. What if that wasn't just coincidence? What if life was trying to show you something? In 2007, a journalist named Laura Lynn Jackson was sitting in a cafe in New York City. She had spent the last few days intensely thinking about a personal project she'd been putting off for years, writing a book about her experiences with intuition. She hesitated. She wondered if it was crazy, if anyone would take it seriously. That's when a stranger sat down in front of her, looked her in the eyes, and said, "You need to write that book. It's going to help a lot of people." They had never met before. Laura froze. She didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or run away. The woman just smiled, finished her tea, and walked off as if nothing had happened. A few days later, Laura began writing the book that would change her life and the lives of thousands of readers. Coincidence? Or synchronicity? Today, we're going to talk about those rare and mysterious moments that feel so perfectly timed, they're impossible to ignore. We'll explore why they happen, what they mean, and how to start recognizing these subtle messages from the universe. Maybe life is trying to speak to you, and you just need to learn how to listen. So, have you ever experienced something like this? Share the biggest coincidence you've ever had in the comments. These stories are always so inspiring. And if you're someone who loves exploring the invisible behind the visible, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell. That way, YouTube will bring you more videos like this one. What really is a coincidence? Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychologists in history, used a different word, synchronicity. For him, they were events not connected by cause, but by meaning. He said some coincidences are so unlikely, so precise, that they can't just be explained by chance. It's as if there's an invisible link between what we feel inside and what happens outside. And that connection, it might be tied to something much bigger than we imagine. You've probably had a moment when everything felt like it was just clicking, like the universe had choreographed the details just for you to notice something. That insight at the perfect time, an unexpected meeting, a subtle sign that made you rethink a decision. These moments aren't random. They act like symbolic mirrors, reflecting our inner state. And when we're more in tune with who we truly are, they tend to show up more often. It's not magic, and it's not superstition. It's as if life had a quiet, but incredibly intelligent way of nudging us, reminding us that we're on the right path or drifting off course. In practice, synchronicity is when the outer world starts speaking the same language as your inner world. And here's the curious part. The more present and aware you are, the more it happens. But why does that matter? Because synchronicities act like shortcuts to awareness. They wake us up, realign us. They help us remember that maybe we're not going through all this alone. So here's a question that might stay with you. Are you really paying attention to the signs life is sending you? Today, we're going to dive into real stories, everyday moments, and powerful reflections to help you understand with clarity and depth how to recognize and use synchronicity in your favor. By the end of this video, you might start seeing the events in your life through an entirely new lens. And maybe you'll also realize that all the pieces are already right there in front of you. You just need to see the bigger picture. Have you ever had a day when everything just seemed to fall into place and you couldn't even explain why? That's the magic of synchronicity, and maybe you're already living it without even realizing. Let's start with a curious story about American writer Jonathan Carroll. He says that one morning he went out to buy coffee. On his way, he stopped at a newsstand, drawn by something. It was a magazine featuring an article on lucid dreaming, the exact theme he'd been struggling to develop in a short story for weeks. He bought the magazine, sat down on a bench, opened it to the article. At the end of the piece, one name stood out. It was a dream expert based in Vienna, the same city Jonathan lived in. Coincidence? Maybe. But it was enough to get him to schedule an interview with the expert. And from that meeting came not only the story he wanted to write, but an entire book. Life builds bridges when you're willing to cross. But this raises a question. Why do these signs tend to appear right when we're about to make a big decision or step outside our comfort zone? The answer might lie within ourselves. Carl Jung said synchronicity is a phenomenon that happens when a content from the unconscious manifests simultaneously in the external world, like a mirror. In other words, the more in touch we are with something that deeply moves us, the more the world responds. And here's one of the most powerful truths about this topic. Synchronicity isn't an isolated event, it's a dialogue. And that dialogue only begins when we stop living on autopilot. Now let's dive into a real story that sounds like it came from a movie. In 2015, a young woman named Julia, who lived in Florence, Italy, decided for the first time to travel alone to the countryside. She wanted to reconnect, write, and find meaning in a phase of life that felt stuck. The night before her trip, while packing her bags, she found an old note her grandmother had written, a poem. It spoke of courage, freedom, and new beginnings. The next morning, Julia boarded the train, and without planning it, sat next to an older woman who struck up a conversation a few minutes later. "Do you write?" she asked, glancing at Julia's open notebook. The two started talking. At the end of the trip, the woman reached into her purse and handed Julia a bookmark as a gift. On it was the exact same poem Julia had found the night before. She was speechless. She cried, and she understood. She was exactly where she needed to be. Coincidence? Or life orchestrating details to awaken something within her? These moments happen more often when we make space for the improbable, when we listen to ourselves, when we step out of a rigid routine and create room for the unexpected to emerge. But what about when synchronicity appears as a warning sign? It's not always here to confirm. Sometimes it shows up to redirect, like what happened to a Brazilian philosophy professor who asked not to be named. He had received a job offer from a prestigious university abroad. It would be a radical change, new culture, new language, new routine. He was excited, but something inside him felt uneasy. To clear his mind, he traveled to visit the campus. On the way, his flight was delayed. When he arrived, his luggage was lost. At the hotel, he misplaced his room key, and when he finally made it to the university, a student protest had shut down all classes for the day. In the end, he realized this wasn't just bad luck. It felt like the world was slowing him down, pulling him back from a decision that wasn't meant to be. He returned to Brazil. 2 months later, he received an even better offer, completely aligned with what he truly wanted. Synchronicity can work like a GPS for the invisible, but only those willing to interpret it can hear it. And that's the point. It's not about superstition or finding signs in everything. It's about cultivating a refined, sensitive, and curious awareness without rushing, without forcing. Now, here's something fascinating. Neuroscience studies show that when we're in states of full presence, our brains make faster and deeper connections between seemingly unrelated ideas. In other words, the more conscious we are, the more we perceive. That's why synchronicity often shows up during moments of change, crisis, transition, or expansion. It's as if the universe is saying, "Keep going, you're waking up." And it doesn't just happen during big life events. Sometimes it's on the way to work, in a random conversation at the grocery store, in a book you pick up by chance, opening straight to a line that answers exactly what you've been feeling. Could it all just be chance? Maybe. But what if it's not? Now stick with me to understand how these meaningful coincidences can become a practical guide for decision-making, personal reconnection, and expanded awareness. There's a quote by Jung that says, until you make the unconscious conscious. It will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That idea changes everything. Because maybe what we call destiny isn't something fixed or predetermined. Maybe it's the reflection of the choices we make, consciously or not, and our ability to notice the signs along the way. Let's go to another real story. In 2011, an Argentine photographer named Lucas decided to leave advertising to pursue art. And, like it happens to almost everyone who decides to follow their intuition, the beginning was rough. One day, he went for a walk in a park near his home, trying to clear his mind. He was discouraged, thinking about giving up. He passed a wall with graffiti, and one phrase in huge letters stopped him in his tracks. "If you don't try, you'll never know what could have happened." He snapped a photo. Days later, that image went viral after he posted it with a short text about the fear of change. The response was so big that an art gallery reached out to invite him to exhibit his series of urban photographs. Today, Lucas makes a living from the art he almost gave up that day. And he says that piece of graffiti was the sign that reignited his courage. Is that fate? Inspiration? Synchronicity? The answer doesn't matter as much. What matters is that he was present enough to notice it. And that's the difference. How many signs have you missed because you were distracted, stressed, on autopilot? Synchronicity doesn't shout, it whispers. And here's the curious part. The more we train our awareness, the more these meaningful accidents seem to multiply. But here's the thing, synchronicity isn't something you force. It doesn't show up out of obsession or anxiety. It happens when we're open, receptive, and aligned with our purpose and inner integrity. Now let's shift the scene and travel to Japan. In Tokyo, there's a bookstore called Tsutaya. It's a massive, quiet space filled with endless corridors, and it's where Mayumi, a literature teacher, had one of the most mysterious encounters of her life. She says that on a random Sunday, she left her house with no destination. She was going through a separation and needed to breathe. She walked into the bookstore with no intention of buying anything, just to wander, to feel. After a few minutes, a yellow cover caught her eye among the others. It was an old book of poems by Basho, an author she hadn't read since her youth. She opened the book at random and read the first poem on the page. It was exactly the same poem her father used to recite when she was a child, a poem she hadn't heard aloud in years. She smiled, cried, bought the book. And right there, sitting on a bench inside the bookstore, she realized she was ready to begin again. Moments like that are unexplainable, but deeply transformative. They are meeting points between memory, emotion, and presence. And maybe that's one of synchronicity's greatest teachings. Life is always trying to talk to you. But are you listening? Now, a key point. Synchronicity doesn't mean an easy life. It's not a magical formula that fixes everything. And it's not always obvious or immediate. Sometimes what makes no sense today will prove to be essential tomorrow. Let's talk about purpose. In 2018, Michael, a retired engineer, decided to volunteer as a math teacher in underserved communities. He had never done anything like that before, but felt a strong calling, even though he couldn't explain. On the first day, when he arrived at the school, a 12-year-old girl was the first to come up to him. She sat in front of him and said, "I dreamed about you last night. You were teaching me fractions." He laughed, thinking it was cute, but the girl was serious. And over the course of the year, she became one of his most engaged students. Months later, Michael learned that this girl came from a very difficult background and that the classes had been a great emotional support in her life. Coincidence? Intuition? A calling? The only certainty is that Michael was in the right place, at the right time, being exactly who he needed to be. And maybe that's what matters most, to be present, whole, and available. Because when we are like that, life finds surprising ways to align with us. Synchronicity can also show up through nature. There are thousands of accounts of people who found answers simply by looking at the sky, a flower, or an animal. Like it happened with Emily, a holistic therapist who was going through a difficult time in her career, full of doubts and not knowing which direction to take. Walking through a park, she focused her gaze on a tree, silently asking for clarity. At that moment, a white feather fell right next to her. In indigenous culture and many spiritual traditions, feathers represent protection and spiritual messages. She got goosebumps. A deep sense of calm washed over her. And the next day, she received an unexpected invitation for a project that brought together everything she loved, something she hadn't even imagined could be her profession. Coincidence? Or any answer that was already in the air, just waiting for her to be calm enough to notice? Now I've got a question that might get you thinking. Are you leaving enough space in your day for the invisible to reach you? Sometimes, the answer you're looking for isn't in effort, but in listening, not in control. Synchronicity is like a dance. You take a step, life responds. But only those who are present can hear the music. What was the last coincidence that made you stop and think, something bigger is happening here? Share it with us in the comments. Because when we share these stories, we inspire others to start paying attention to theirs too. There's something most people don't realize. When you start noticing more synchronicities, it's a sign your awareness is expanding. It's like becoming more fluent in the language of life. And the more you open up to that dialogue, the more life speaks back. Here's the thing. The next message might not come in the way you expect. It could show up in a small gesture, a random conversation, or the very next video you're about to watch. So stay here with me and let YouTube guide you to the next step of your journey. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.